What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today, we're going to be working on a 2008 Mercedes-Benz W211 E63 AMG. Today on the W211 behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace your flex discs or guibos. Now, the AMG behind us is equipped with two, one on the front half, one on the rear half, and these are responsible for joining the drive shaft to your transmission as well as your differential. They act as a damper versus having a traditional U-joint in your drive shaft. Now, what's nice about these is that they provide a more smoother ride quality, but over time, like any rubber product, degrade, they're going to age, they're going to crack. So one thing you can do to inspect them is simply by looking underneath the vehicle. You have enough openings within all the heat shields and exhaust to take a look at them and see the quality and finish of your flex discs. As they get older, they'll start to crack, they'll dry rot, they'll tear. In some extreme cases, they'll fully deform. And by that point, you should be able to feel some sort of vibration or hear some knocking in the transmission tunnel of your vehicle. So obviously we want to avoid that. Now, in front of us, we have a Febby Bilstein kit. We actually have two of them, and they include the flex disc and all the hardware necessary to do this job. In addition to that, we're going to be linking below the exhaust hardware that we're going to be removing, which for a New England car like the one behind us may be a little bit rusty, so we're going to put in some fresh parts while we're doing that as well. But before we get started on this job, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this DIY. And now for tools. For this job, I have a couple different size pry bars. I have a 3/8 drive torque wrench as well as a ratchet with a couple adapters, including a swivel adapter. We have a T45, a T60, we have an E12, an 8mm, a 13mm, and a 16mm socket. We have an 18mm wrench. We have a hammer. We have some exhaust hanger pliers here. These are really awesome in getting off those rubber hangers. And then a couple, not super necessary, but would recommend, electric impact tool, a flashlight. We have some snips in case we have to cut some zip ties or add some zip ties. Dielectric grease, which will come in handy for the exhaust reinstall. Right here I have some Mercedes-Benz wheel bearing grease. However, you can use a general purpose grease, which you'll need on the ends of the drive shaft. And then a paint pen if you want to mark down your hardware after you've torqued it. And then not pictured here, but necessary, depending on whether you're working on the lift or at home in the garage or on the floor, is either some screw jacks, hydraulic jacks, or jack stands, which will come in handy when you remove and install your exhaust. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, to get started, we're gonna go ahead and start by removing our rear splash shield. We're gonna do that in order so we have some better access to the hardware that holds the pipes to the manifolds, as well as the wiring for our oxygen sensor. So we have 6 8mm bolts. Let's go ahead and zap those off. Now we can go ahead and remove our shield and set it to the side. Now we have our shield removed. What we're going to want to do is follow our oxygen sensors and find which one goes to which electrical connector. And then so we don't mix them up when we reinstall everything, what I like to do is you can use tape, a marker, a paint pen, or zip ties. We'll go ahead and zip tie the electrical connector and plug for, we'll say, the passenger bank, and then the left bank we'll leave blank. So let's find our wiring, we'll unroute it and we'll disconnect it, and then we'll mark it up. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and follow the oxygen sensor wire coming out of our exhaust. Clips to the side of the transmission, or the bell housing, if you will, with a couple metal clips. We're just gonna pull it out. There's gonna be a couple other wires there too, so just be mindful of that. And we're gonna follow it. Goes right down there to this electrical connector. We're gonna pop it out from its bracket, and we'll go ahead and release it. And again, we're gonna do the zip tie thing just to be safe. Let's just say these brackets weren't there or they got moved for another job. You don't wanna have to guess which connector goes where. Now we have both of our oxygen sensors unplugged. Now we can go ahead and work on getting some hardware removed. All right, my good people, now we're gonna work on loosening up the hardware that holds our catalytic converter portions of the exhaust to the manifolds. before I drop any of the hardware, I'm gonna just set up one screw jack here on the center point, just to kind of support everything, even though our member here is still connected. And then we're gonna grab our E12, coupled with a couple extensions. We're gonna have to customize them as we do each bolt, and we'll work on zapping those out. Now let's go ahead and use our impact. I have 2 extensions on here. We have about 14 inches worth of extensions on our E12. Let's see if we can get this outside left-hand side bolt first. Now we're gonna go ahead and head over to the passenger bank and repeat the same steps. Now we have all 4 of our E12s removed. We can start working our way back, grab our 13mm socket, and continue on. Next, we're going to remove these 2 13mm bolts that are part of the supporting brace. We're going to try to keep this exhaust whole when we drop it. So if you were trying to do just one piece at a time, you can just go ahead and tackle individual pieces of it. So there's some clamped sections in here that you can separate. 13 on the impact, we're going to zap these 2 off. Again, we have our screw jack supporting this whole part. If you don't have that, it will fall on you. If you're working at home, in the garage, or in the driveway, or a body shop, doesn't matter. You can replicate this with hydraulic jacks or jack stands. Next, we have the supporting brace that we're going to remove. It's held on by 4 T45s, so we'll zap those off. Now we have the supporting bar removed. We're gonna get our next screw jack ready, and we're gonna start getting ready to start undoing some hangers. All right, moving back, we have 4 hangers in the rear that we wanna detach, starting with 2 intermediate ones in front of the axle shafts, or you have 2 at the rear drums or rear mufflers. So what I'm doing here, I only have 2 screw jacks to work with, and we're working on the lift, so it's a little bit tricky versus having it on the ground with a bunch of floor jacks. But I'm supporting the right half, so I'm going to work on removing the right side of the hangers first, and then that way I'll be able to work over to the driver's half and kind of use myself as the 3rd screw jack, and then I'll grab somebody from the content team and I'll have them help me lower the whole exhaust. So let's grab our pliers. I love these things. We'll go ahead and remove this first hanger. And if you don't have these pliers, you can soap these ends up of these bushings a bit, and WD-40 works well, or some sort of penetrating fluid, even silicone spray, just enough to be able to get you to start working that off with a flathead or a pry bar, whichever one you got lying around. Now we're going to go ahead and repeat the same steps on the rear hanger. Now let's head over to the driver's side, and we'll do the same thing on the other 2 hangers. Now we're gonna go ahead, I'm gonna grab my buddy Mike to help me. I'm gonna have him lower the front while I handle the rear section, and we'll slowly drop the whole exhaust. There we go, my good people. The exhaust is dropped. Again, just friendly reminder, we totally missed it at the beginning, but make sure you disconnect all 4 oxygen sensors up front. Use a zip tie method to differentiate them. Use a paint pen. You can leave one clipped in, one clipped off, whatever you need to do so you don't mix up the 4 connectors. But now with that situated, we can go ahead and actually work on removing some heat shields and getting our drive shaft out of here. All righty, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 8mm. There's speed nuts and some couple bolts that hold these 2 shields together that we're going to want to remove next. The reason for that is so that we can access the center support bearing. We're going to need to lower that so that we have some give in the drive shaft. So to get that off, 8mm socket, we'll go ahead and zap all of them off. If you haven't taken this off ever or in a long time, just be prepared for a lot of debris to fall. Keep your eyes shielded, your ears. Oh, yeah. Oh, we only have to remove 4. The center two are going to keep the shields together. So that's going to be easiest for us when we reinstall. So let's go ahead and set these to the side. All right, now we have that shield removed. The next step is going to be to support the transmission with the screw jack. Then we're going to go ahead and work on removing this transmission mount. So let's go ahead and get set up for that. Using a screw jack and a nice piece of wood, we're going to go ahead and support the transmission from below. You want to make sure whatever you're using to support here by the pan, you don't want to center all the weight of the transmission on one portion. You want to distribute it evenly so you don't damage the pan. So that's why we're going to use a decent length piece of wood that'll span the whole bottom of it. Right now we're just taking a little bit of the tension off. Now we're going to get our socket and our gun, and we'll go ahead and zap off the 8 bolts. We have 2 that go to the transmission itself that connect the mount to the trans, and then we have these 6 supporting for the brace. We have 6 15 millimeters at the bottom that we're going to want to undo first. Now with those removed, I'm just going to lower the transmission a hair. Okay, that way I know there's no tension on this. Then we have 2 more 15s on the mount side to remove from the back of the transmission. Now would also be a good opportunity to replace this mount if it is indeed bad. But ours is in pretty good shape, so we're going to go ahead and live with it for now. I'm going to go ahead and thread those 2 bolts back in though, just so I know that they're there for when we reassemble everything. Beautiful. With those removed, we have full access to our front flex disc, and our rear flex disc is pretty exposed as it is already. And we'll get you up here nice and close so you can see these are original. Our car has 145,000 miles on it. They're pretty worn. They're not fully torn. Let me grab an example to show you what they can look like. Here is a fully failed flex disc. This is pretty extreme. This came off of one of our Mercedes race cars, but you get the idea. They tend to tear, the fabric starts coming out, and then you get a lot of sloppage in the drive shaft. So with that situated, now we're going to grab our paint marker. I'm going to make a couple marks so that we can align everything properly before we start disassembling. So let's do that next. All right, on both ends of the drive shaft, we're going to take a marker and we're going to mark our drive shaft with the flange that it's bolting up to. So right now we're on the differential side. I'm going to make myself a mark on the differential side, and then I'll go ahead and make that same mark on the drive shaft. That way we know these 2 ends are going to be aligned the same way when we put it back together. Now we're going to head over to the front half of the drive shaft and do something similar. Now this one's going to be a bit buried, but we'll show you better once we start rotating the assembly. But for the front half, I'm just going to do a line. The reason I'm doing a line is I don't accidentally want to mix up the ends of the drive shaft should we need to drop the whole assembly. We're going to try to kind of avoid that by using some of the bracing that's in place still, but we'll get to that in a moment. Another thing while I have you up here, you'll notice the drive shaft flange has just the head of the bolt that goes straight through to the back of the flex disc. On the sides where you're bolting to the transmission flange, meaning there is no drive shaft flange on this side, you're going to have your bolt and the washer. So just be mindful when you assemble everything, which we'll cover again. But you want to take a picture if you're going to forget what this looks like, or just jot it down. But rubber side, you have bolt, washer that goes through to the transmission. Drive shaft side, you just have bolt, flange, and then it goes through to a washer and then your nut. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and jump into the car, throw it into neutral so that we can go ahead and rotate this assembly. For those of you working at home in the garage or on the driveway, that'll be fairly simple. You can just climb in. So we'll go ahead, get the car in neutral, and then we'll start loosening up some flex disc bolts. All right, my good people, we're going to start on the front end of things. We're going to go ahead and start breaking free our T60s and counter holding with an 18 millimeter wrench through the back. You have more than enough room to squeeze one in between the trans and the flex disc here, like so. And then I'm going to give it a shot at breaking them free with the impact. If not, we'll go to our traditional ratchet. T60, 18 millimeter. So again, just a reminder, drive shaft flange, you're going to have your bolt, goes through everything. On the receiving end, you have your washer, and then you have your lock nut. For the non-drive drive shaft and hardware, you're gonna have bolt, washer, and then just a nut on the other side. So I'll show you that as we go around. This one we'll have to use the open end as the nut sits back a little bit more due to the drive shaft, or the transmission flange. And on the front side, we have our washer and our bolt. You can see how cracked this one was. Again, not terrible, but it was definitely starting to show its age. Now you might be wondering, Mike, why did you drop all this exhaust and heat shielding and everything to get to these squeebos? I see people doing on YouTube where they just do the ends here and pry them out. The reason with that is, if you start prying at the end of your drive shaft, all you're doing is breaking and damaging your center support bearing. This is not designed to flex front and back. It's simply designed to keep this drive shaft from vibrating and in one place. So every time you see someone prying at the end of the drive shaft, all they're doing is tearing or damaging that center support bearing. So just something to keep in mind. Now I'm gonna keep these last two, one flanged from the drive shaft and one flange from the transmission side bolts. I'm just gonna break them loose, but I'm not gonna remove them just yet. Now we have most of our hardware removed. We're gonna go ahead and keep two of those bolts in, one on the drive shaft end, one on the transmission end. And we're gonna go ahead and keep this brace in here for now. Now we're gonna head over to the back side of the differential. We're gonna do the exact same thing. We'll remove most of our hardware. And then once we have the last two bolts broken free, then we can remove our center support bearing hardware, and then we'll drop the whole assembly as one. We should be able to clear the flange here with this member still here in place. The reason I'm keeping this one here is just to kind of act as a guard for me so this doesn't just fall when we're removing the center support bearing. If it gets in the way, we'll just remove the 213s and we'll drop the bracket. But for now, let's head over to the back and do the same thing. All right, same thing, T60 18 mil nuts on the back. We're gonna go ahead and zap these off. We'll leave one or two on there to help us for when we remove the whole drive shaft. We're gonna go ahead and just break free this last one, but we're gonna keep the nut and bolt on there. And then I changed my mind. We're gonna bring that screw jack over to this end and we'll lower the two E12s on the center support bearing. All right, with that nice and loosened up, now we're gonna head over to the center support bearing. We're gonna play around, like I said, with the placement of the screw jack, but we'll zap off those two E12s and then we'll go ahead and start lowering down this drive shaft. We have two E12s that hold our center support bearing in place. All right, and now our goal is going to be to remove the remaining T60s. I left one in the back, two up front. And then I'm going to use this, like I said, this brace to kind of help support everything, as well as the screw jack. And we'll start slowly working the drive shaft out until we can get it on the workbench. And the reason we're going to do that is so we can grease up the ends before we put it back in. All right. The drive shaft is fighting me. It's basically glued itself to the guibo, which is also glued to both flanges. So I'm gonna do what I mentioned earlier, which was possibly zapping out that 13mm bracket, and then we'll try to lower the whole thing forward. Careful not to separate the two center sections of the drive shaft. All right, so as you probably saw there, luckily I got Mike helping me here, but our ends of our guibo, which we'll show you on the new one, key into the back of the differential flange, and just due to corrosion, they were literally just seized in there. So maybe a smart thing would be for the future, if you're doing this at home, or keep the center support hardware in place so you don't risk dropping this on your face. Luckily I had a second set of hands, so now we can go ahead and bring this over to the workbench. We'll grease up our ends and then we'll get ready to reinstall it back up with some fresh flex discs. All right, my good people, we are at the workbench. Wanted to talk about these flex discs a moment and the reason why this one was such a bear to pull out. Now, each flex disc has dowels on either side of it, which you'll see clearly on your nice new unit. that key into the flanges. They key both on the drive shaft end and the transmission and differential end. Now, it just so happened that both of ours on both sides were just corroded and they were both stuck on there. They did not want to come out. This is the first drive shaft job I do where the flanges were just stuck to each other with the flexes. So keep that in mind. You want to be careful. Obviously, you don't want to hit yourself in the face or somebody else when you're removing these pesky drive shafts. So with that being said, we can get rid of our old crusty unit. On the drive shaft side of things, we're going to do a little bit of maintenance. Mercedes recommends that you clean up and re-grease the ends that key into the drive shaft. This is just Mercedes-Benz wheel bearing grease, but you can use any general purpose grease for this application. All right, and then we're going to go ahead and do the same thing to the other end, and then we'll get ready to reinstall our drive shaft. So you can see we still have to pry off the guibo on this side, which we'll do before reinstall. So we got the other flexus off. You can see we soaked it a little bit with some penetrating fluid, pried at it, ended up just whacking it off with a hammer while Mike helped me hold the drive shaft together over here. Now we're gonna go ahead and get ready to feed it back into place. We're gonna be paying attention to the dowels on the flex disc itself so that we make sure we key them in properly both on the drive shaft end and on the transmission and differential end. And we're also going to look for our dots and marks that we made so that we can line up the drive shaft the same way we took it out. So it's going to be a little bit of a art charade here. You can arguably go ahead and start some hardware on the flex disc and the drive shaft end loosely if you want. We might give that a try. Because it's such a press fit, I'm just going to tap on the flex disc to the drive shaft, and then we'll see if that's enough to hold them into place while still giving us enough room to feed them into the recipient end. So you'll see me do that on the front, and then we'll get over to the vehicle. With both ends of our drive shaft fed in gently, we're going to go ahead and start our Torx bolts on the center support bearing by hand so that it can support everything for us at a proper height. We're not going to tighten them down, we're just simply starting them by hand. All right. Now with that lightly in place, we can go ahead and make sure our alignment marks are in their proper spots, and then we'll start feeding some fresh hardware through. Starting out back, I'm going to go ahead and use that same hammer that I used to blow off the old flex disc. The side going into the differential flange, so meaning no flange on the front, gets the washer, and then the drive shaft flanges get no washer. They get the washer on the back side. So we got our bolts, an ET60 and washer. Make sure you wipe off any debris or grease that you may get on the threads of your new bolts. You don't want to mess up the torque values. We're just going to start them all loosely first. Again, flange side, no washer on the front side, just a washer on the back with the nut. All right, now we're going to grab our T60 back on our impact and our 18 mil to counter hold. And I'm going to do the drive shaft flange first and then the differential flange hardware after. It really doesn't matter, but which one you pick first. We're just going to snug them down and then we'll torque them down properly. Now we're going to go ahead and torque each one of these down to 60 Newton meters. The counter hold with our 18 and we'll torque down with the T60. And then so we don't get mixed up, you already know, my good people, we're going to mark them up as we go. Beautiful. With that done, now let's head over to the front half and do the exact same thing. The transmission side, flange is a little bit more tricky. You don't have as much room to work with as you do on the differential side. So you kind of want to work at an angle and get the hardware started that way. All right, now we have all 8 of those torqued. We're gonna go ahead while we're over here and reinstall our bracket. It's held on by 2 13s. We're gonna go ahead and torque those down to 20 Newton meters. Before we reinstall the transmission mount, we're gonna go ahead and tighten down our center support E12s. I'm going to use the markings on the bracket so that I can reinstall this in the same position that it used to be. Same as the other brackets, we're going to torque these down to 20 Newton meters as well. Most of our hardware down here will be torqued to that. Always okay to use an extension as long as you have proper angles and you're grabbing the torque wrench at the proper end. Now with that situated, we're gonna go ahead and reinstall our transmission mount. I'm gonna pull out the 2 15s that I threaded in here before, and then we'll get ready to install it. And we're gonna go ahead and, you guessed it, torque it down to 20 Newton meters. Go ahead and mark them down. Now we can use our screw jack to go ahead and make this just flush with the bottom of the car. And then we can hand start all 6 of the short 15mm bolts. Plug them down with the impact gun. Torque them down to 20 Newton meters. With that situated, we can go ahead and lower the screw jack for now. We're gonna hang on to it as we're gonna use it when we reinstall our exhaust. But now we can go ahead and reinstall our aluminum heat shields. Then we'll just snug them up with electric impact. All right. Now, my good people, comes the more challenging part of reinstalling the exhaust. So this is going to be a 2-person game here. I'm going to have my friend Mike help me get it situated on a screw jack up front, possibly one in the rear. One thing to note with the rear section of the exhaust, you kind of have to tuck in one drum or one muffler section in first underneath the bumper, and then you can tuck the other one in and then center everything out. One thing I recommend is you pre-grease the opening on the rubber hanger so that when the metal hanger portion of the muffler end or midsection end goes back into them, they kind of slide in so you don't have to fight with them. So a little dielectric grease works, a little silicone spray, whatever you have. Just you don't want to use something that's going to deteriorate the rubber hanger. So we'll get those greased up, and then we'll pick you back up once we have the exhaust kind of situated on our screw jacks before install. Now we have the rear all situated thanks to our good friends from Content Marketing. The whole group came together. We have all 4 hangers set up in the rear. Now we're gonna head up front. We'll start tucking in the hardware for the front manifolds, and then we'll also work on connecting our mass airflow sensors once more. All right, now we're gonna work on bringing the front end up of the exhaust so that we can get our 4 bolts started. As I bring it up though, I'm gonna tuck in the upper or the pre-CATS oxygen sensor wiring into our clip. And then as we get a little bit higher, then I can do the second clip. And again, this is a good reason to why we mark them all a little bit differently. One of these is painted. I was concerned for a moment. This one's plain, one has a zip tie, and then the other one's plain for the opposite side. So mark them however you need so you don't get these mixed up. But for now, I'm gonna tuck this upper one first so that I'll be able to get it in there, because once this is higher, I can't reach it. And then we'll do the same thing on the other side, and then we'll start going up. With our exhaust bolted back in, now we can go ahead and reconnect our oxygen sensors as well as our bracket back here. So let's pick it up with the oxygen sensors and then we'll work our way back. We go ahead and clip our cables in first, and then we'll feed them back into the metal clip up top. Clip it back up. And we can tuck our wire back up, just like we did the first one when it was going up into the car. Now we can clip our other oxygen sensor back in. All right, we got our oxygen sensors clipped back in. On the passenger side, we'll go ahead and do the same thing on the driver's side. Now we can continue to plug in our sensors on the driver's side. Moving back a bit, we can go ahead and reattach our two 13s for these for the center bracket here on our exhaust. Then we can reinstall our center brace back here in the center section of our exhaust system. We got our 4 T45s. Same thing, you're going to want to torque these down to 20 Newton meters. With that situated, my good people, all we have left to do is grab our 8mm bolts and reinstall our splash shield. All right, now we can reinstall our splash shield. All right, now we can sap all 6 back in. Boom, baby. And there we have it, my good people. Another DIY in the books. This one was a bit of a doozy, handling this big, heavy exhaust and then having to drop the drive shaft. Obviously, doing this on a lift is a lot easier than doing this in your driveway or in your garage. The only thing being in your driveway or your garage, you don't have too much travel to worry about when you drop the exhaust. And I would argue it's almost easier just throwing around a bunch of jack stands than it is screw jacks. But I ramble. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, or there's something specific you want to see done to this vehicle, leave it in the comment box below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.